The psychology of insight. The neuroscientific view of insight allows to understand the neurological processes that underpin the moment of insight, but what exactly is insight from a cognitive psychology point of view? Indeed, aha! Moments are one of the most intriguing and unexplained processes of the human mind. From a cognitive psychology perspective, attempting to place the insight phenomena into a proper theoretical framework to provide scientifically valid explanations of why the insight phenomena occurs has been difficult. Famous American psychologist William James put forth the first psychological theory of insight known as the associationist theory of insight, which proposed that new ideas are combinations of existing ideas, that sudden insights are merely the result of having a lot of information and being able to make connections between facts. These connections are made during a suitable incubation period, an unguided, unconscious process whereby individuals simply take time off from the problem. A competing view of insight was put forth by the German gestaltist Karl Duncker, who was attempting to explain the psychology of insight and thus put forth proper definition of insight. The Gestalt view of insight described it as a process based on reconstructing the core of a problem, rethinking its basic assumptions and originating a new and creative solution, a process usually occurring in an unexpected and unpredictable manner. The Gestalt view of insight differed in that they believed insight problems are solved suddenly and therefore no chain of connections could explain the discovery. This view suggests that insights occur while performing an analysis of the problem in which you are drawn to a potential solution, but then realize it cannot work. This is referred to as an impasse, in which your mind becomes fixated on a particular solution and you therefore become incapable of exploring the problem from other angles. The solution arrives not by making incremental associations but by overcoming the fixation, thus allowing a restructuring of a problem that allows you to eventually arrive at a solution. Restructuring is conceptualizing the problem differently, essentially seeing the problem in a whole new way, hence the solution is sudden and surprising. Individuals are not consciously aware of how they overcame the problem. Other theories have been proposed to provide theoretical framework to explain insight. For example, the progress monitoring theory by McGregor et al. Is based on the hill-climbing idea that problem-solving proceeds with the problem-solver seeking to minimize the gap between the current state of the problem and the goal state. Individuals begin attempting to solve a problem by putting forth what they believe is an informed solution, which is then subsequently altered by making incremental improvements to the solution, thereby getting closer and closer to the correct solution. When such incremental improvements do not result in the correct solution, the individual reaches an impasse, often likely due to the individual becoming fixated on an incorrect strategy or incomplete information. Now the individual must search for a new approach to solve the problem. This theory implies that individuals constantly monitor their own progress in order to promptly switch to a different problem-solving strategy in case the current one is not successful. This theory suggests that the aha moment may be achieved with an incremental approach, with constant monitoring of one's own cognitive processes as a pivotal feature, making the aha moment more like a conscious epiphenomenon of a general problem-solving process rather than a burst of uncommon cognitive processes. In contrast to the progress monitoring theory, Knoblich and colleagues introduced the representational change theory, which offered an alternative explanation of how an impasse is overcome, that is, through a reorganization of a problem's representation. Representation can be thought of as the distribution of activation across pieces of knowledge in memory. This theory suggests that the problem is first represented using information or knowledge that is not relevant for the solution, hence an impasse is reached. Once this impasse is reached, the representation is altered such that relevant information becomes active and a viable solution merges into consciousness. Knoblich et al. Suggests that the main issue of problem solving is an individual's tendency to set unnecessary constraints through a very restricted representation of the problem, which is a function of limited, incomplete or ambiguous prior knowledge. Once the impasse is reached, by relaxing the unnecessary constraints that have been placed on the problem by deactivating the recalled knowledge linked to the problem or decomposing elements of the task by dividing it into perceptual chunks, a new representation of the problem can be reached. Progress monitoring theory and representational change theory differs primarily in how one deals with an eventual impasse that impedes a solution. Bowden and Beeman have proposed another theoretical framework to explain insight by attempting to link a cognitive psychological model to actual neurological processes within particular regions of the brain. The theory proposes that insights occur when the initial representation of the problem initiates a strong semantic activation of information that allows for the generation of obvious solutions to a problem, and a weak, unconscious, semantic activation of remote, alternative information important for the generation of non-obvious solutions to a problem. The weak semantic activation, which is responsible for allowing remote associations to be made, is thought to be produced in the right hemisphere, whereas the strong semantic activation is thought to be produced in the left hemisphere. Initially, solvers may be unable to take advantage of weak solution activation because it is weak, and therefore might be blocked by stronger, more focused, but misdirected semantic activations. A new restructured representation of the problem emerges when integration of weakly activated information and subsequent associations made therein are reinforced, strengthened, and ultimately emerge into consciousness. It is important to recognize that both hemispheres of the brain involve complementary processes that work synergistically to produce a solution. Information is shared between the two hemispheres. It is the presence of this laterality that allows the solution to merge into consciousness. However, it is thought that the right hemisphere is predominantly responsible for the generation of non-obvious solutions to a given problem, i.e., creative problem solving. Psychological studies of insight suggest that the good Gestalt theory is largely false. The consensus among scholars is that insight is primarily a function of previous experience and acquired knowledge. Rather than a sudden restructuring, the mind seems to gradually get closer to the correct solution. And that's pretty consistent with the association theory and the Bowden and Beeman theory that creativity occurs when existing ideas combine together. The existing ideas on the new metal structure are new, they're familiar ideas and conventions that are already in the domain and then have been internalized by the creator.